Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. My voice is a little shot. I'm not feeling as great today. I think this is just the normal time of year, right? Where sickness comes and my body starts slowing down because the football season is all but over, and it's just fun, right? And so I apologize if I sound dead. If there is a little extended pause, it's probably because I'm getting a drink of water or something. But we're going to get through this because, there's a lot to talk about. So let's just jump right in. So today, just kind of preview the episode. We're going to start with some news by recapping the early signing period, do a little look ahead to the 2026 roster and the transfer portal priorities. We'll do some college football playoff fallout. Not much. I mean, for Utah, it really doesn't matter. And then we'll do a little brief look at Utah's bowl destination and its opponent and kind of get into that. But, we're not going to go too heavy on any of that kind of stuff. So before we do that, let me tell you about our partners at Cafe Rio. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have them ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com. All right, so let's jump right into this. Just kind of putting an end note to what was the last podcast last week. I did the podcast on Wednesday, which was the early signing day period, the first day of the early signing day period. And, I had teased that Celesi Moa was potentially going to flip from Tennessee to Utah and sign, and that did indeed happen. And so Utah picks up their second highest ever recruit, second highest only because Kelvin Obot, their 5-star that they picked up this year, the offensive tackle, is now the highest. So you sign two of the highest ever recruits in Utah program history. These are the 24/7 composite highest recruits. So, you can always find something that is, maybe higher or whatever that may be. But this is the situation now where you just signed your two highest recruits ever, and to do that coming off of a 5-7 season the year before, obviously you pair that with a 10-2 season this year, but to do that is pretty remarkable. All of these types of things, you don't really know anything about these players in the sense that you don't know how they're going to factor in. Are they going to gel well at Utah? Is it going to work out? That's tough to see. But I think with your top two guys, when Kelvin Obot, he comes from a good coaching pedigree in Idaho. And so you've got an opportunity there with Jordan Gross coaching him. He knows exactly what Utah's going to want. And, there's potential to have him as kind of a freshman starter already. So you've got some potential there. And then Celesi Moa, legacy kid, his dad, Ben Moa, who's incredibly excited. You can see that a lot on Twitter. And just kind of the excitement that he's had for his son to be able to be at his university. Moa has a lot of potential to be a day one starter as well. But don't pencil these things in as gospel, right? I mean, these kids still have to get in. They have to acclimate. They have to be the guys that the optimism is about. And so we'll see. But I think, for as far as it goes, those two have as good of a chance of any to make the roster and be able to be an immediate impact player. Utah obviously signs the rest of their class. There really wasn't much drama there outside of one, and I'll get to that in a sec, but you pretty much pick up all of the players that you want, and we'll see, if this class has anything to it. Some of these guys are going to be a little bit more development. Some of these guys are going to be more impactful players. As you saw this year, Utah, utilized a lot of freshman players. And so it's not that Utah is always just loading up for depth pieces, especially knowing that in this day and age, the depth pieces don't necessarily stay around that long. But you've got potential contributors, and you filled some needs that you have, while still knowing that there's going to be more. So the biggest drama over the weekend/week was the Pulu twins. This is Jaron Pulu and Keenan Pulu. These are the two guys that were originally committed to UCLA, backed off that commitment after several months, and then committed with Utah. But there was always kind of this tug and pull to BYU. That's where they're from, that's their area, and so there was always this pull there. And so as much as this came as a shock to many people, this really didn't come as a shock to many people that followed this, right? There was kind of like a silent commitment to BYU for a long time. I started hearing rumblings about this in October. Wasn't really too shocked by this, but at the same time, there's obviously going to be PR wins and different things going that way for these guys flipping to Utah or BYU. And that's not to say it's not, right? Like these are two talented athletes that are going to do potentially well at BYU. And, Utah would obviously like to have them. There's that world where if you got Celesi Moa and the two Pula twins, I mean, that's a great haul for Utah, especially for in-state talent. So you can be upset about it and want to be upset that Utah couldn't hold on to that. But at the end of the day, you really don't know what these kids can do. You don't know what they're going to provide. And, it was always a long shot in a lot of ways for Utah to get there. They made a competitive offer. This wasn't something that Utah wasn't necessarily hoping to lose, right? Like it's not like a lower player on the recruiting class where you're just like, if you lose them, you can find somebody else. Like these are guys that they wanted, right? But at the same time, there wasn't a lot of sleep lost because of losing them. And the reason for that is because you were able to get Celesi Moa to flip. So the Moa flip came a little later. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of belief that it could actually happen. That came much more closer to the week of early signing day. And so it was kind of a nice surprise knowing that you were most likely going to lose the Pula twins and have that as an option. So not a bad spot to be in, but you obviously could have been better. So at the end of the day, Utah, they stayed pretty committed with what they had. Their class stayed pretty committed with what they committed to. And so it was kind of a pretty drama-free in a lot of ways signing day, and I think that bodes well for Utah because they got guys that were just committed and ready to go. So, that's kind of it. We'll see what happens. A majority, if I remember right, only 2 of these players that signed will not be here for early signing day. That could change, but it sounds like, or not early signing day, excuse me, for spring period. So basically coming up here in a month. They'll join the University of Utah. And so that bodes well for Utah moving into next fall, where you get a lot of these guys already conditioned and in the system and ready to go. So the chances to be able to contribute next fall are much higher in this regard, assuming that they make the right strides and can find a place on the roster. So, this class is pretty well shored up. You've got a lot of potential there, and everything is kind of set in, and then that moves forward really to the transfer portal and that kind of stuff. So what you have now, you're going to see a lot of that into spring. You'll get to have an understanding of who these guys are. With the way that the transfer portal is now set up, there's not a risk necessarily of playing some of these players in spring like there was in years past where you had a spring portal period as well. And so, you can see a lot of these guys where you could potentially put them out in spring and kind of have much more tape out on them and kind of see what they can do in a more public setting, which helps preserve some of these spring games and allows you to be able to hold your class for the fall. So there's some good things that come of this, especially with the new transfer portal schedule. But at the same time, you'll at least get a decent look at some of these guys in spring and have an idea of what they can do potentially in the fall. So with that, let's kind of shift a little bit of what 2026 could look like. And what I mean with that is more the guys that you need to stay, right? And the biggest question there was always going to be at quarterback. You needed one or both of the players to stay, meaning Devin Dampier and Bird Ficklin. The pipe dream was always that you could get both of these guys to stay and that you can continue to run a pretty dynamic offense with both of these guys in the backfield and knowing that both can contribute, right? Like Dampier isn't necessarily in risk of losing his job, but at the very least that you, one, have a competent backup that can step in for him if he gets injured. And obviously the nature of his game lends itself to that a little bit. And some of the injuries that he sustained this year aren't fully because of that. But, that's just part of it. But you also have an upside in a guy that if he can stay there, you can find him on the field at times, right? Like you don't have to just utilize him in a full backup capacity. He's clearly proven enough that he can get in there and be a game changer, even while still having Devin Dampier on the field. And then that translates more into 2027, right? Having Ficklin potentially take over. You do want to see more of his passing game, and we want to be able to kind of see where that goes before you can fully say that Dampier or Bird Ficklin can be the guy in 2027. But I think you kind of get that it factor with Ficklin where you're going to figure it out, right? You do need to see more. And I've talked about this many times, so I don't need to rehash all of this, but you do need to see more from him to be able to have that belief. But at the end of the day, you've got two talented athletes that can stay. So with that, it sounds like everything is trending in the direction that will be the case, that both of them will come back. I know a lot of people complain that loyalty is dead in this day and age, but I think both of these players see that this is a great opportunity for them. Dampier, obviously, transferring to another place would be not as easy, not to say that it couldn't happen, but that would be much more difficult. Ficklin obviously would have his suitors and would want it, but I've heard that he really likes this. You're obviously seeing a lot of tweets the last week-ish from coaches and from Ficklin himself and from his dad and many other people that I've retweeted that indicate that these two are locked in, and I've heard that's the case. So we'll see officially if that's really the case. Really, no news is good news in a lot of ways, but it sounds like both of these guys are back. You obviously want to know what's going to happen with Wayshawn Parker. I've got no indications that he will leave. My understanding was that he did sign a multi-year contract, but in this where there's no real teeth in the contracts, that doesn't really hold a lot of weight. It's more about losing future earnings, but you could offset that by getting future earnings from another program. So you kind of get some wiggle room in there, but it sounds like there is a lot of potential for him to come back and get there. And so for that, offensively, that's your core, right? You obviously can't just rely on those three players to make an offense go. But at the same time, those three are going to be the ones that absolutely change a lot of what you're able to do. And so that's a good opportunity there. Beyond that, you're also locking up potentially your coordinators. We still don't know anything about Kyle Whittingham. I'm still leaning on the side that he is returning. Everything and everybody that I've talked to has leaned that way, but there still is something up in the air where you don't know, right? And I think there is potential for Whittingham to walk away. I think he sees that. The real question here is, just what it does for the long-term viability of the program. And as long as you have Morgan Scalley, locked in, there's no real harm, right? Obviously, that's going to probably mean more money or different things that help that. Jason Beck's going to demand more money just simply because he has been, there's a lot of interest in him in the G6 ranks to be a head coach. There's also been offers in the Power 2 for him to be an offensive coordinator there. And so, you're fending off a lot of places that are going to want him. And so that's just going to naturally come with more money. But Utah is clearly invested in who he is, regardless of Kyle Whittingham or Morgan Scalley. But, I assume, like I said, that it's going to be Kyle Whittingham returning. It could have some poetic side to it in the sense that the number 22 has been, linked to Utah, and obviously that comes off of tragedy. So you have to be careful how you utilize this, right? Like you don't want to use 22 as necessarily a positive thing by any means. I mean, it has been shifted that way a little bit, but at the same time, you have to recognize, how 22 has become significant for Utah. So what I'm getting at here is this would be Kyle Whittingham's 22nd year next year of coaching at Utah. If they really want to go out that way, that kind of lends itself even further to the number 22 and kind of lean in that way. I don't know that that's necessarily a deciding factor for Kyle. I think he just genuinely loves coaching, and he sees the prospects of Dampier and Ficklin and kind of what else he can do. You look at what their schedule is next year. There's real potential for Utah to make some noise again next year, barring health and getting the right pieces and not losing, the wrong pieces, so to speak. There's potential there. So, it could be a little poetic in the sense that Kyle Whittingham can go out on the 22nd season, but I'm kind of tired of saying that it could be this next season because honestly, at this point, nobody knows. I don't think Kyle knows. I did an interview with him that I wrote a story about where he told me personally that he's nervous to walk away and what that life looks like. So, I think it's not easy for him. And, as long as it's not hurting the program, and you can argue that it's clearly not hurting the program at 10-2, assuming that donors want to continue and there's continually effort to keep the program going. And if he still has the mental capacity and the desire to be able to move forward, which he does, there's no reason not to. And especially if you can keep Morgan Scally, happy and entertaining. At the end of the day, right, like Kyle's job is not to worry about Morgan. He does because it's kind of setting up the program past him. And so there's going to be some considerations and things in that relation. But at the same time, Kyle deserves to be able to go out when he wants to, regardless of putting a head coach in waiting or not. I've mentioned this several times. Like I believe that Scally will be a good head coach, but at the same time, it's tough to say that, you want to force somebody out when you have a guy that has been proven, right? And so that's kind of where it's at, where you want to keep Kyle and moving forward. So as long as the staff remains happy and everybody's pulling in the same direction, it's a good decision, right? If there's discontent and problems and people are frustrated that Kyle's still hanging on, yeah, that's going to cause some problems. But I think there's some opportunities there, and I think this team can really do well next year, especially if you do keep these pieces all together, right? And I think that's generally the consensus, that you're going to keep a majority of these pieces together. You now have potential to go build in the offseason and move forward with that. So, I spent a little longer on that aspect of it, but I think you're getting your key offensive pieces back. Now it's moving forward and trying to build out the rest of your roster and make sure that comes forward. As we saw, quarterback is the biggest one, and it looks like Utah's got their quarterbacks locked up. You've got your offensive coordinator seemingly locked up based on getting a new contract here soon. Things are moving in the right direction where you can now build the pieces. And this is conversations that have already started. Last week was strongly in the retention direction. Obviously, Utah was waiting for a bowl destination, and they knew fairly early that it was going to be Las Vegas. But you're more looking at retention and trying to keep and maintain that roster. And so that's been the big emphasis this last week. And so far, so good. But with that said, transfer portal season has begun, but it's a little bit more delayed, right? In years past, where the transfer portal essentially opened right as the regular season ended. And so you were getting a lot of fluidity in teams still preparing for bowl games or college football playoffs and still kind of balancing how their roster makeup, worked. That's not to say that that's not the case now, but because they've pushed that transfer portal deadline, which is the single portal deadline, you're not going to get multiple portals now like you did in the years past. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink. All right. Sorry. It's just the nature of this, but you're not going to get multiple portals now. You're going to get the one. That shifts things a little bit. So right now you're still seeing players enter the portal, or at least intending to put their name in the portal. You can put that in there, but you can't really do anything with it until that portal period opens. And it's a smaller portal period. And so it's players are going to still put it out there, but you still got a while to understand what that is. And so you do have some players that can still play in their bowl game without having that hanging over their head of saying, like, I want to go in the portal, but I also want to play for my team, causing that dynamic and causing problems that way. This is now a world where most likely schools are going to have an understanding of a player coming back or not, or at least they have a direction of where they think a player may be headed, but they may not have to officially designate that until later. And so that gives the player a little bit more time. That gives the teams more time for roster building and stuff that way. It may even be it can't work that way. I was going to say something about the transfer portal, but it doesn't work. But it's a situation now where you can kind of hold off a little bit more and not feel like you have to rush and get everything done. And so I think that's going to be good for all parties. It's going to be able to be beneficial where you're not necessarily getting the emotional ties to that season. You can kind of let it simmer a little bit and not feel like you have to immediately put your name in the portal. You can now let that sit a little bit, see where your role fits, have some good conversations with coaches, which these were happening before anyway, but they're not as escalated in terms of we got to get this done ASAP. It's now an opportunity to do it in a little bit slower manner. That's not to say that they're moving slow, but that's kind of the direction it is. So as it stands, Utah has already lost 3 players, 2 scholarship players. One was a quarterback, Drew Cowart, who was a walk-on. And then you do lose yesterday Jalen Mosen, corner who transferred to Utah last year. There's a lot of optimism about him and kind of what he could provide. But I think with who Utah has with Scooby Davis and Donovan Saunders, there's potential that he's not going to be that lead guy. And so, I don't know necessarily even the fit. I know he wasn't always getting in the mix of things, and so you kind of see the writing on the wall of where you're going to be. But I think there was potential for him to be a contributor, but he's entering the portal, or at least plans to enter the portal and move on. And then you get Christian Thatcher, who was a freshman linebacker, a heralded one, 4-star guy, was pulling in the right direction, said all the right things coming into Utah, and then just unfortunately wants to enter the portal, knowing that potentially there's guys ahead of him, right? Like there was moments where other guys got on the field this year and he wasn't one of those. Didn't really factor in a ton in spring either. Granted, he's a freshman, right? Like that's the nature of it. And so we'll see. So with that, I know it looks like a big loss. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I'm not saying this in relation to him at all, but there's different reasons for portal players, right? Like some want to be able to go, get into a bigger program. Some want to go somewhere where they can get maybe a guaranteed start. Some players may be encouraged to leave because they don't fit into the plan. And that's not necessarily to say you need to go in the portal. It's more like we don't see a role for you in this as of right now. That doesn't also mean that a player can't work his way in there, right? That's used more as a motivation tactic as well to be able to get a guy to say, hey, look, you're not in the plan right now, but if you work hard, this is where you can be. Sometimes that never pans out, right? And you'd be better off transferring. But there's a lot of different things. There's also situations where players and their agents cause a little bit more drama than is needed, right? Always asking for more money, asking for more demands or whatever that may be. And some, this is getting treated more and more like a business where teams just have to say, look, we're not going to do it. I've had off the record conversations, not even with the football team, but other programs within the University of Utah where there were conversations that said, look, this is what we're willing to do, right? Like we're resting on business and this is what you're willing to do. And, you can let it simmer for a bit. And in this case, it actually worked out for Utah and they got the player that they wanted. And, that their demand at the time wasn't really a reality of kind of what the market was giving them. So I can't say too much to what that was or what program it was or anything, but there's conversations like that, right? And so I'm not saying any of that necessarily applies to any of these players. And ultimately, only these players will have a good understanding of what that is. But just because you lose a player doesn't always mean that it's a bad thing, right? A lot of people are going to chase the stars. A lot of people are going to chase a lot of different things and say, okay, he was a 4-star or he was this. And, it sometimes just isn't a good fit. And so with this, take transfer portal season, I don't want to say with a grain of salt because there are definitely players that can leave that can hurt a program, right? I would say, and Kyle Whittingham has backed this up as well, that Utah has definitely been a net positive in the transfer portal era. You have lost players that have, validity and substance that could be clearly a part of your program, but at the same time, by and large, Utah has done better bringing in players than necessarily losing them. That's not always going to be the case, right? You're always going to have some players that leave that hurt, but at the same time, you've got some players that have by and large done well. And I mean, last year you can look at the offense just in general with Devin Dampier, with Wayshawn Parker. Those two players alone kind of showed what kind of opportunities you have ahead of you with transfer portal players. So it's a give and take, right? And at the end of the day, this is a business. And I know attaching that to an educational element and a college, it's kind of a disconnect right now, and there needs to be things that fix that. But at the end of the day, this is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a minor league to the NFL. We get that. I understand it's hard, and I understand it's tough to be able to see players come and go. But I think, the hand-wringing of this doesn't have to be that case, right? Just because you lose a high recruit doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing. So that's kind of where that is. I feel like I'm taking a little too long on some of these things. Excuse me. Whatever. So with that, you do lose 3 players. You're going to lose more, right? There's going to be some more, and I've heard a couple names that have potentially put their names out there as potential portal additions. We'll see. There could be some that hurts, but some of that could also mean that it's all about value and how Utah views them and where they see themselves and how they fit and all that stuff. So, there may be more of that. Some of them may hurt, some of them may not. Some of them may look like they will hurt and they don't. So it's just hard to know, and we won't really know until the next year. Most players that left last year weren't necessarily big contributors for their respective programs that they went. So it's not all doom and gloom, I'll say. With that, looking at the priorities for what Utah's going to need this year, and the number one priority has to be wide receiver. That is, by and large, the number one priority there. There's many, many areas of the team that you need to fill, but this is, if you have the bulk of your money and you need to attract top talent, there's others that you still need to get there. But if you need to attract top talent, at least one, it's going to be wide receiver. And so right now, looking at this in terms of priority of the receivers that they do have still on the roster for 2026 and kind of who you want to keep, my priority right here, and priority meaning this is who I think you kind of need to invest in. That doesn't mean you necessarily need to keep, if that makes sense. I will say the first-ish few are probably both, where you need to invest in them and keep. But if, you can find whatever. I'm just going to move forward. So needing to return, J.J. Buchanan has to be a guy that you get there. And I'm putting him at wide receiver because that's where they've essentially, that's where they recruited him. That's where they've put him in the last little bit of the year, where he's playing much more as a wide receiver. I know they toyed with him as being a tight end because of his size, but he's playing in the wide receiver role. And so I'm going to link him in there, knowing that whether he's a wide receiver or a tight end, you're going to need him. And he's clearly proven as of late to be a great asset for Devin Dampier. He's a big body that can go up and get difficult catches. He can win the 50-50 battle. He can be physical. There's a lot to like about him. He's quick. So there's different things there where he becomes, in my opinion, priority number one. And I don't get the sense that he's not going to be, but I think he's priority number one. Number two is Larry Simmons. And, this is a guy that really started to come on strong at the end of the season. You really got to see what he's capable of. This is the guy that maybe didn't have necessarily the wide receiver one potential, at least on paper, in terms of what people were looking at. But he's clearly getting into that realm where he's a guy that can be the relied upon guy, especially when a guy like Ryan Davis went down. Larry Simmons was a guy that Dampier could connect with well. He made toe-tapping catches. He made, acrobatic catches. He was, Kyle Whittingham calls him touchdown Larry. He's a guy that continues to find ways to be impactful in the game, and that's what you need in wide receiver. You need a guy that can just create that separation, and even when the separation's not necessarily there, can go up and get the ball, and he's been able to prove that. So he's a guy that you have to definitely lean in on. Beyond that, you've got Dadrian Zipperer, who was getting a lot of potential as a maybe wide receiver one type look. Excuse me. And so we'll see what he is. Coming off of an injury, we still don't fully know what he's capable of. There was a lot of optimism about what he could be. But, I think you still need to kind of invest in him and see what he can do. But at the same time, I don't want to say if you lose him, it's not the end of the world. But I still think he's a guy that you need to invest in to see what he is. I don't get the sense that he's out there looking for a different destination. It'd be much tougher, especially out of an injury. But it's more just based on kind of how Utah views him. And if they still view him as a guy that they can build around, then that works. If it's one of those things where you go into the portal and say, hey, we can do better in the portal and you're going to be at best a depth piece, maybe there's a decision where you encourage him to transfer. I doubt that, but you never know. So he's still a guy that I think you have to prioritize. Creed Whittemore, I think you're starting to see more and more from him early on. Excuse me. This is where the sickness is really getting strong when I'm talking too long, so I apologize. Creed Whittemore is a guy that started early where, he was trying to see the field, right? He wasn't giving the coaches a ton of confidence in being able to catch the ball as well and being able to be a guy that they could rely on. As he progressed through the season, he stayed with it and clearly got his opportunities, especially when Ryan Davis went out and became a guy that was relied upon. I still think he's part of their plan, right? And I think you need a guy like that to be in there. I think he's going to be a great asset. And then beyond that, Mana Carvalho, he's a guy that he's got speed. You're pairing him out now more as a kickoff returner, that kind of guy. But where can he factor in this wide receiver game? I don't think he's the guy that you're going to say we have to have him in the wide receiver game. You're utilizing him in a lot of different areas, but I still think there's a guy there that you want to keep. So there are pieces here for Utah at wide receiver. With that said, you do need to get more assets. And I know that Utah is going to invest more in their NIL money to be able to get a star wide receiver. The question is, can they get that, right? Can they compete with other programs? They're obviously going to be looking for star wide receivers as well. If they can, this Utah team suddenly takes a step up, in my opinion. If you can get wide receivers who can get separation, who can be a factor in the game, and give Devin Dampier and Bird Ficklin, bona fide targets, that changes how this team is. You know that this team can run, right? And that's going to change a little bit with the offensive line, and I'm going to get there here in a sec, because we don't fully know what that offensive line is going to be. But you know that this team has the capability to run in whatever facet that may be, whether it be in the QB run, whether it be in Wayshawn Parker and whoever else they get behind to line up with him. There's a lot of avenues there where you can get that. And you're still going to get Beck, who is going to scheme different things that allow that. But if you can now add, that threat, that downfield threat, that changes a lot of what this team can do. One of the biggest knocks on this team, obviously, this year was that downfield threat. There wasn't a lot of options or open receivers to get the ball to. Now, with that said, Dampier still needs to take the next step there, and some of that was his injury. Some of that is he's not going through his progressions as well. There was some watching in the Kansas game that I got really frustrated watching because, his progressions were a little too slow and he was missing guys, and, there's things there. And so you've got to pair that there, but you're also going to get Dampier now having a full season again with people that you don't have your security blanket of Ryan Davis, where now you have to spread the ball around a little bit more. Obviously, he's built a connection with J.J. Buchanan and with Larry Simmons, and so there's connections there that he can start building off of. But now you can start building that with other guys that can demand the ball, right? And if that happens, this team takes a next step forward where you've already shown that you can be a top offense in the country. Now, if you compare that with a potent, wide receiver threat or a passing game, that team completely changes and you become much more of a threat in the Big 12 than you already are. So that's going to be priority number one. Offensive line is going to be the number two priority, and mostly at offensive tackle, and that's going to demand a lot of money. Offensive tackle is one of those positions where clearly there's a lot of need and desire to have star offensive tackles. And so if they can find a guy that has experience, that is good, that can come in and be kind of a stabilizing force, that's going to bode well for Utah. There's other pieces along that line that they can build on. Offensive guard is a position that you can build on as well, but I don't think that is as important as having a key offensive tackle. That gives you already the depth pieces that you've got building beyond that, but you get Kelvin Obot, assuming that he can factor into that game. You can get, or into that line, starting as a freshman. Now you've got more consistency there and being able to help that. So I think if you can get that, that gives you a much higher ceiling of what this team can be, assuming that you recruit the right way. But I trust Jim Harding to find the right guy, right? Like he's been able to do that year in and year out. So, we'll see what that can be. Utah honestly hasn't had to go to the portal too often for offensive linemen. They have gotten guys, but it's not one of those positions that they've done a ton with. But, if you can invest some money and be willing to pay some top dollar for some of these guys, that's going to bode well. And I think you see more and more this year why that matters. If you can if you can substantially show the fans especially why a good offensive line matters, that gets you a lot more buy-in from donors, gets you a lot more buy-in from fans, and it just kind of shows the whole operation working, right? And so I think last year with what Jim Harding was able to do with his line proved that, right? Sure, you have two guys that are potential first-round players in the NFL, but you've got talent, right? And you were able to develop that, and you were able to move it forward, and because of how effective they were, you saw how effective Utah could be in their game, where they could do pretty much anything that they wanted, and that changed it. So if you can use that as a selling point to offensive tackles, you can use that and pair that with money that is now in there with new donors, or donors now spotting more money, that helps. So offensive line, especially at offensive tackle, is going to be a key priority. Next is going to be tight end. You essentially don't really have many tight ends left. You do have Hunter Andrews, who has always been kind of a hybrid player. I think people forgot that he exists because he got injured so early. But he's the guy that you can obviously lean on as being your number one guy, but you're going to need more, right? And I think Utah's going to do a lot to be able to try to recruit in that position, try to find guys that are going to be key weapons there. You do have Drew Clemens, who's a freshman. We just don't know what he's going to do and factor into that, or if he'll be a part of their plan. But essentially, that's kind of a whitewashed room, right, where you're going to have to completely remake it and do what you need to make that work. Beyond that, I would say the fourth tier here, it's not, in my opinion, the biggest of priorities, but it's obviously a priority you're going to need, is defensive end. And largely just because of John Henry Daly's injury. It is an Achilles injury, but I believe that he's going to try to get back into the season. That's just a challenge. He's obviously going to have a lot of suitors for him as well, simply because of his ability. I forgot to look up this stat, but I think he's still in the top 5 of sacks in the country. He may have even top 3. I can't even remember. He's like a sack off from the leader in the country, which is David Bailey at Texas Tech. So, I mean, this is not that far removed. He's going to demand a lot of attention, assuming that there's good, prognostics based off of his injury and kind of what his timeline could be. But assuming, let's just assume that Achilles injury doesn't allow him to play for much of the season at all, then you do need to have a bona fide defensive end. And that's not to say that Utah doesn't have that in their room. It's just a little bit more murky. You still have potential where Logan Fano can come back. He did walk, but he does have another year that he could come back. I personally don't believe that he will, although there is an advantage for him to do it. He's older. He's had multiple ACL injuries. His opportunities in the NFL probably aren't really there. And so why not come back and run it back for another year and get paid? So if you do have Logan Fano, I think that instantly helps you in the defensive end room. Then it doesn't become as much of a priority to me. But I think if they don't have him, you're going to rely on depth pieces, which they have that they love, but you're going to have to rely on more depth pieces, which becomes a little bit more of an unknown. But I think you see, especially with what Texas Tech did, when you invest heavily on a good defensive end. I mean, look, you can invest in every single player, and that's going to change the dynamic of a team. So, I don't want to sit here and pretend like these are the only positions that have that. But I think you see how disruptive and dynamic that can be if you do get a top guy. Utah's not going to be able to compete with necessarily that. I guess they could if they wanted to, but I don't see that being the top priority. Like I said, wide receiver, offensive line, those are going to be the two where you're probably willing to spend more But if there's another position group that you are going to spend a lot, it's going to be defensive end, and you're going to spend a lot simply just because that's a coveted position. So we'll see kind of how Utah goes and what direction they move. But that's going to be another area. Right now, Utah has Lance Holtzclaw, Paul Fitzgerald, Cash Dillon, Jackson Jones is kind of your backup guys. We've heard a lot about Cash Dillon over the years, and so we'll see what he can kind of provide. Paul Fitzgerald was injured this year. Is he part of the plan? Is he, moving on? We don't know. I think he's still a key figure in the room that people like. Lance Holtzclaw came along really well coming into fall camp. It's just more kind of development and growth there. So we'll see. I don't think Utah's in a world of hurt, but at the same time, they may kind of flirt with defensive ends in the portal. So to me, those are the top 4 priorities. Obviously, if there's position groups that are decimated from Utah players leaving, that can change things. As of right now, I don't get that sense, either based on who Utah's bringing in through its freshman class or depth pieces that they already have. Utah seems pretty set. Like I said, corner, you're essentially locked up with 2 of your guys. The guy that you wish you could have is Blake Cottonback. I mean, he really came on strong late, but you can't get him. So you got to find somebody like that can really buy in, get into the program, and really hone in on that. But by and large, linebacker may be a priority. You do have some depth pieces there and being able to move there, but it's not going to be the top. So there's different position groups that you can look at, but I think this is one of those where Utah, their priorities is definitely going to be wide receiver, O-line, tight end, and then defensive end if you need to. So that's kind of that. So real quick, just kind of we've gone on a little long with this, but a little bit of the college football playoff fallout. This is one of those where we'll see what happens. I don't really care to get into all the semantics of it. Should BYU have gotten in? Should Notre Dame have gotten in? Should Alabama have gotten in? Like, I don't fully care to some extent. I will say that Notre Dame, I know a lot of people were frustrated, and I think it's stupid of the committee to have Miami below Notre Dame just for them to flip on an idle week. I mean, that's tough, and I understand their rationale where when finally compared head-to-head, the only real difference was a head-to-head win. But at the same time, like, there's better decisions that can be made here. With that said, also, watching Notre Dame, it's clear that they're a better team than what was kind of put out there. And I know a lot of people are kind of bagging on them right now for, take your ball home energy type stuff. I tweeted about it as well. So, I get it. But at the same time, I did an interesting exercise where I went to Parker Fleming's website, College Football Graphs. He's a guy that I look at for most of the season as something kind of, for me being kind of a numbers nerd, he's a guy that I look up to in terms of what he's able to do and kind of the niche that he's carved out of what he's done. But he has that website, CFB Graphs, where you can essentially do pairings and matchups and be able to see how a certain team would stack up. And while I believe that this isn't an end-all, be-all, I think it is a good descriptor or helper in that regard of what it looks like, of what Vegas would favor these as. You can go in and pair these up and put them in a neutral site arena. You can put them at, if you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty and say, okay, Notre Dame would be an away team and not get a first round bye, so this is what it would be. You can get into that. But what I did is I went through and I just wanted to see kind of how Notre Dame would, stack up with the 12 teams that were selected. And when you look at the betting spread, there's only 2 teams that would have had a better spread against Notre Dame. And it's not even that close either. Like, Indiana is a half-point favorite against Notre Dame. Ohio State has the largest one at 6.5. Beyond that, every single other team would be an underdog to Notre Dame, with Texas Tech being the closest at just being a half a point favorite. So that's a pick'em, right? Like, that's a pick'em game. But every other team outside of Miami actually was a 2-point underdog to Notre Dame, so that's a pick'em game as well. You essentially have Notre Dame favored in every single one of the games. So, like, advanced stats don't tell the full truth, but it also shows, like, what the potential can be. And so, like, the argument that Notre Dame shouldn't have been in there, is tough, right? Like, I think they had definitely a full case to be able to be in there. How this, I bring all this up mostly because of what this could mean moving forward for Utah. This is now obviously a situation where the Big 12 is not getting the respect that it needs, but at the same time, you've got to fight that against bigger name brands, right? But at the same time, you've got to find ways to be able to get in there. And Utah had this case where, you go beat BYU or you go beat Texas Tech and suddenly that changes, right? Like you're in a top 10 at that point. Had you beat BYU, you're easily in the top 10, and, maybe you take your foot off the gas a little bit with some of the teams down the stretch. But I think Utah, with a different result against BYU, suddenly is now in that mix, and now you're being able to be considered in that. So, Utah did itself dirty in that regard. But at the same time, like, the Big 12 has to find more favor in this selection committee. And so the problem with this is the selection committee standards and views and everything change, and so that's going to be a tough situation. But I think Notre Dame not getting in is going to force many conversations to be had. This is the first year where probably Notre Dame was docked for not being in a conference, though that's kind of a hollow argument as well. But I think there's going to be a lot of conversations about this, and Utah has to find a way to be able to fit in whatever that conversation may be. It may be out of their control. It most likely is out of their control. But you've got to find ways to be able to get in there and be a part of that conversation. Utah clearly was part of the conversation in terms of being able to be ranked high, but there was always a ceiling for Utah where even though they were ranked 12th, or even if they were ranked 11th or whatever that may be, they were always on the outside looking in with no real key avenues in. And I say this mostly because of next year. Next year, there's not a lot of signature wins. A lot of signature wins looking on Utah's schedule. Now, that's not to say that some of these teams can't change and they can't be bigger teams next year. But on paper, there's just not a lot of areas where Utah can falter. And so how do you keep yourself in there? Is it all about winning? Yeah, probably. That really is what it comes down to. But how can you find a way to be able to maybe not rig the system, but find a way to be able to see what the selection committee's done? And the problem is there's no real easy way. Either way, you've got to invest in some potential of being able to show how you are going to be good. And a lot of that can be running up scores like they did this year, beating teams badly, and then just honestly winning games. And I know that sounds simple, but I think that's really what it comes down to, right? And I think you've got to find ways to be able to do that. Look, I'm not going to sit here and have some revolutionary thought that says this is how Utah can get into the playoffs. It's really just going to come down to winning. And for these teams, you even look at Texas Tech. I think everybody understands that this can be a team that can be a force in the playoff, but they're still, regardless of their season and only losing one game, they're still being looked at as potentially a team that's not going to be able to compete with other programs. So, there's always going to be that bias and that problem. And so you've got to figure that out. And that's easier said than done. Notre Dame would love to know how to figure that out as well. BYU would love to know how to figure that out as well. There's a lot of different things here where there's a lot of competing interests. But as the committee now moves forward, or the college football not the playoffs, but it is whatever. It's not the selection committee, but a different committee to decide how this goes. Is that 16 teams? Is it 24 teams? Whatever it may be, Utah's got to find a way to get there. And I think with what they've got returning next year, that has to be the biggest goal of all time, right? That was a goal this year. They clearly wanted to be in the playoff. They clearly wanted to be in the Big 12 championship. But you've now got the roster where that can kind of be a reality. So as this relates, you've got to find whatever it takes to be able to get in that conversation. So doing that through the transfer portal, getting through the donors, whatever that may be, trying to find ways to be a part of that. Because at the end of the day, this is how it's going to shape up. And if you don't stay involved in that, you're going to get left behind. And you can see how damaging it was last year for Utah when they got left behind. Now, look, they were nowhere near a playoff hunt. They were 5-7. That's what I'm saying. But you've got to find ways to remain competitive, and that's going to mean attracting top dollar. That's going to mean getting top players. It's going to be in an arms race, which you may or may not be able to do. But at the same time, the university has to do whatever it can to be able to stay in that conversation. And as much as being 15 in the playoff is good, it's not going to be good enough. You've got to continue to get there. You've got to keep advancing the Big 12. You got to keep advancing anything that you can to be able to make that work. And it's still not fully in your control, but this is now Utah's top priority, because everything else, basketball, gymnastics, soccer, whatever that may be, that's not going to have a conversation. That's not going to help. This is the big priority, and this is where Utah needs to invest fully. So, little, side note, but nothing really of substance in terms of kind of how it affects Utah this year. But this is kind of the direction that you have to go and have to move forward. So let's move over to the Las Vegas Bowl here in just a sec. Let me tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right. Lastly, Utah was picked to play in the Las Vegas Bowl, and I know this one, after what they did in 2023, this doesn't feel the same. It's, you get to go to Las Vegas, but I think this actually has a good potential for Utah, assuming that a majority of your starters play in that game. Utah's favored by 14.5 against a Nebraska team that went 7-5. It's third season for Matt Rule. This has the makings for where Utah can kind of end its bowl game skid. Utah obviously started out really well under Whittingham and got to 11-1 in bowl games, and then suddenly went on a 5-game skid, and 2 of those are Rose Bowls. So, those are high-end games, and you had Ohio State on the ropes essentially for a long time until losing it at the end. But this is now a ton of potential where Utah can win this bowl. And I understand that bowl games don't necessarily have the same value that they used to, especially in the college football playoff era. But I think based on kind of the season that Utah had and where they're at, this feels like maybe not a referendum on the season, but kind of a look at, what Utah can do moving forward. If you can go in and get this bowl and win it, that's just more of a good trajectory moving forward. It's not by all means the end-all be-all. These are exhibition games, and they should be treated as exhibition games, especially with some players not playing. I would say Spencer Fano shouldn't play personally. There's no real reason for him to play, but I could also see him wanting to play and do something. But, we'll see. It's hard to know what's really going to happen in about 3 weeks, but I still think this is a situation that Utah needs to win. And they need to try hard for it, and you can't go, the half-ass effort. You have to go in and work really hard to be able to get that. So, yeah. So real quick, just kind of looking at Nebraska, we'll do deeper dives on this and talk to people that have a little bit more insight on Nebraska. But just looking at who Nebraska is, like I said, they're 7-5. They were finished 4-5 in Big Ten play, 10th in the league. If you really want to go that deep, the biggest games here where you can kind of compare, they beat Cincinnati at Arrowhead Stadium early on in the season, 20-17. Early season game, tough to know really what that meant moving forward, but at the time Nebraska looked like a good team and was on the verge of potentially improving from where they are. They did improve from where they have been, but being even better than what they were. The other comparison is they beat UCLA at the end of the season 28-21. Utah obviously, blew out UCLA at the beginning of the season, so, comparisons that way. And then there are 2 other games of note, I would say, in terms of closeness, is they lose to Michigan 30-27, so a top 25 team, and then USC 21-17. So that's just kind of a look at kind of who that team is. Good, but not great. A lot of issues there, but the biggest thing going against them now is their personnel that's going to be returning. So Dylan Raiola, their starting quarterback, the guy that everybody's kind of heralded as this next top quarterback in the league, and it hasn't fully kind of come about yet. He suffered a season-ending injury. There's been a lot of conversations about him kind of looking elsewhere and kind of having a wandering eye. And so he's not available. His uncle, who was the offensive line coach, was dismissed from the program, and so that's not available either. So you're starting to see the Raiola family kind of dry up at Nebraska a little bit. That has no real bearing on this game other than he's already been out, so you don't have to worry about it. So you've got a different quarterback that's going to be in there, and he's been okay. Nothing great. It's clearly I wouldn't even say clearly, but it's a step down from Raiola. So you got to kind of see what that could be. But we've seen quarterbacks in the past that have beat Utah that either aren't as great as they should be, whatever that may be. These games are exhibitions, and it can be crazy. The biggest news, though, for Nebraska is Emmett Johnson, their lead running back who's rushed for 1,500 yards, was kind of a fringe Heisman candidate in terms of kind of just his production. This year, quite honestly, the Heisman was a lot tougher. None of these guys had generational numbers, or they weren't putting up these numbers like Joe Burrow did at LSU or anything that way. So it's much more muted this year than in years past. And I submitted my vote yesterday. I can't talk about it specifically until after the vote is done, but it's a tougher season. But Emmett Johnson was definitely in that conversation of guys that were kind of fringe Heisman candidates. He rushed for a ton of yards. He declared for the NFL draft on Friday, and so I would assume he's not going to play in the bowl game. There's no real advantage for him to play there. If he does, that changes the dynamic of this team, where now suddenly Utah has to respect a star running back, which clearly the last two games can be really detrimental. But you also have 3 weeks to prepare for that. They're going to prepare for that either way, assuming that he plays, unless Johnson declares early that he is out. But if he is out, Nebraska is in a much more world of hurt because their second leading rusher only has like 113 rushing yards, and those came in game 2 and 3. So there's not a lot of production, coming back. Even with Johnson, though, as their leading rusher, the team finished 81st in rushing in the country with only 144.7 yards per game. So it hasn't always been this high production run game. I would assume that they try to emphasize that a little bit more, knowing that Utah has struggled against the run. But this has been much more of a pass-heavy team. Not pass-heavy per se, but more an emphasis on passing. And so we'll see, the quarterback, what he can do. Utah's been pretty decent in their pass defense. And so it's not necessarily an easy thing for Nebraska. But there's that. They also fired their defensive coordinator, and will have an interim defensive coordinator in Phil Snow, excuse me. So, we'll see what that can be. You can get a different look. 3 weeks is a hard time to fully change a lot of stuff, but enough time that you may not have a clear picture of what they're going to do. So does that. The biggest thing here, their strengths have been pass defense. They're second in the country in pass defense, which just so happens to be an area where Utah doesn't really put a lot of emphasis. Not to say that they don't, but it's not their big emphasis. And so having Nebraska have that as their strength is kind of an advantage for Utah. Their weakness, run defense. That is definitely going in Utah's advantage there, assuming that Utah plays their star guys. They rank 96th there. They allow 171 yards per game. Utah should be able to run the ball there. Their offensive line hasn't been that great in protection. They've allowed 30 sacks this year, which ranks 108th. They're allowing about 2.5 per game. I mean, this lends itself really well to Utah blowing out a Big Ten team. And, it's easy to kind of paint that picture right now, but easier said than done. Bowl games are kind of a nightmare and a mess. So there's that. Like I said, we'll jump into that more as the weeks go on and get into that. But nothing really of substance right now until we get closer to the bowl game. Beyond that, there's going to be the conversation of bowl seasons ending. What does this mean? You saw Iowa State and Kansas State in the Big 12 opt out. They were fined $500,000 each from the Big 12 for not accepting a bowl invitation. But I think you're seeing teams just seeing this is not as valuable as it used to be. Clearly, we've been in this realm for a little bit, and that was before even the 12-team playoffs, came about. But I think you're starting to see just a little bit difference. And so what do these bowl games look like? I still think they have some value, but it's not as much as it used to be. And so wins or losses don't really matter as much. Notre Dame obviously opted out, and they had a potential to be in a bigger bowl game, but still doesn't matter. So we'll see. We'll see what happens and kind of see the rhetoric around that and kind of go there. So looking forward to kind of a future episode, I want to go back and look at kind of the bold predictions episode we did with some of my colleagues, see how it all shook out, see where Utah ranked, not ranked, but landed in terms of our bold predictions. So we'll kind of do that episode at a later time. Sorry, my throat is giving out at this point. It's been an hour and it's dead. So we'll do that in a later episode and kind of get that. But just as a little tease as well, the Red Rocks are doing their preview on Friday. I believe this is a free event for anybody that wants to come. I could be wrong, but this is just, and they're not competing against anybody but themselves. And that's always what gymnastics is, truthfully. But the reason I bring that up is because Kyle Whittingham and Alex Jensen, the men's basketball coach, have been selected to be celebrity judges. I'm really fascinated to kind of see how that goes. So not only do you get to go see, the talented gymnasts that Utah has that are going to compete for a national championship, but you get to see Kyle Whittingham acting as a judge. So whatever that means, how that goes will be fascinating. But we'll see kind of what that means. But for me, I'm signing out today. Hope my sickness didn't hurt you too much. Hopefully I was able to stay strong and get through this. But we'll continue to go through all these things, kind of see how the transfer portal is playing out. Right now it'll be more just guys that are leaving because Utah can't get anybody in the portal yet. But we'll kind of move forward with that and then slowly prepare for Utah and Nebraska. Obviously, the Christmas season's coming up, so enjoy your time and the holidays and all that kind of stuff. And then we will go back into that and preparing for the 2026 season as well as everything else goes on. So with that, signing out today, and we look forward to chatting with you at another time. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you later.